Okay, welcome back. It's time for our second regulatory spotlight, and this is going to be insights from the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, or ENISA. And our special guest today is Dr. Andreas Mitrakas, Head of Unit for Market Certification and Standardization at ENISA. He is based out of Athens, Greece, where he's joining us today. Andreas, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Bruce, and all many thanks, and particularly to David, Bill, and Skadden, of course, that came up with the suggestion. Well, on behalf of ENISA, let me share the view that it's important, it's great to talk to stakeholders, and just on my end, it's of particular interest to talk to a legal audience. It's a rare pleasure, I would say, these days.
Thank you. We have co-moderators today. So we are doubly blessed here. We have Bill Ridgway, a partner at Skadden. He is based in Chicago and previously served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, where he was the deputy chief of the National Security and the Cybercrime Section. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Bruce.
And finally, we have David Simon. He's another partner at Skadden, based in Washington, D.C., and co-head of Skadden's global cybersecurity and data privacy practice. Previously served as a Pentagon Special Counsel and Chief Cyber Counsel to the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. David and Bill, let me turn it over to you.
Bruce, thank you so much for the warm welcome. And Andreas, we're so delighted to have you with us. Everyone who's listening in, what we wanted to do is set the stage, and then we're going to have a conversation about the role of ENISA in European cybersecurity. I had the pleasure of spending the last 2 years living in Brussels and practicing in Brussels and getting to see this firsthand. And so I'm so delighted that Bill and I have a chance to have this conversation with Andreas and for all of you to hear. So recently, of course, there's been a lot of changes coming from Brussels that make it clear to anyone who's watching that GDPR is not the only thing you need to worry about when it comes to European Union and Europe related data privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity. And they've adopted a number of regulations that really strengthen and safeguard communications and data sectors across many different areas that you all work in. The EU strategy for cybersecurity has really been responding to the threats that have been out there, the threats to critical infrastructure, the threats to many governments, industry, and to citizens. Some of these are criminal threats. Some of them are nation-state related threats from China, Russia, and other foreign powers. And so I'm going to mention a couple of them, and then we're going to dive right in with Andreas. Of course, many of you may be aware of the NIST directive, which is the Network and Information Security Directive, and then the sort of 2.0 version of that, NIST 2, which aims to enhance cybersecurity across the EU and increase cooperation between EU member states. When you have a cyber incident, as you're hearing about in these other sessions, or many of you out in the world in industry are seeing, there's a big question. Am I an operator of essential services? It was narrowly defined. Now it's much more broadly defined. And what it means to comply with that is quite complicated. But we know there's a 24 to 72-hour notification obligation. And there's a variety of enforcement risks. Another key development coming from Brussels is DORA, the Digital Operational Resiliency Act, which requires a whole range of third-party risk management measures be implemented for financial services entities and also for tech companies. I'm not going to unpack all of that, but it is a game changer in the roadmap for 2024 for many companies is focused on compliance. The Cyber Resilience Act, nothing like this exists anywhere else in the world. It mandates the products with digital elements only be made available in the market in the EU if they do certain things. They have to meet IoT security requirements. They have to do vulnerability reporting to ENISA. Again, this is the devil's in the details, and this is still to be ironed out. But for IoT connected devices, this will be a real game changer for makers, for users, and for most tech companies and companies that rely on tech heavily. And then last but not least, and where we're going to spend even more of our time, is on the EU Cyber Certification Scheme, which relates to not just tech and cyber generally, but cloud, SaaS products, and the like. So we're gonna hear more about these. So we hope that over the next half hour, you really appreciate the deep dive and what we hear from Andreas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bill, who co-heads our cybersecurity and data privacy practice, to talk about the evolving cyber threat landscape and the role of ENISA.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's certainly a place where there has been a lot of changes, just the things that David noted, kind of putting GDPR aside, there certainly appears to be an effort to put the onus on like the tech sector and related industries to secure and be resilient and to face the threats that we know all of these entities face in this time. Andreas, I think it would be helpful just to start things off if you could, help us understand, if you were speaking to like the business community, what are two existing EU cybersecurity requirements that you think businesses should be most focused on right now?
Right. David, Bill, many thanks for the question. Let me just take a wee step back and just make a suggestion about what we're up against. According to the ENISA threat landscape, which is a recognized product that comes out regularly throughout the year for the last 12 years or so, currently the top two threats concern. Apologies. Maybe I've done something. No, I think we're good. Sorry. The top two threats currently are ransomware and malware. That's on the top of the list of CISOs across Europe and probably beyond. But as we are verging towards 2030, these threats morph to variants that are far more complex, and we're talking about supply chain attacks and misinformation. One can draw the conclusion that from simpler threatening actors, life forms, that are the puppets, we're moving closer to the puppeteers. And I think that David made nice geopolitical suggestions. I would not tend to see it any differently. So I suppose that when you have a jurisdiction like the one that we have in the European Union, it's just a matter of time when large-scale attacks might just prevail. We had the experience in Estonia already in 2008. It was geopolitically motivated, and it was a wake-up call. It even started on something that looked like a minor incident about perhaps a piece of decoration in a town or a city. So I think these are pretty fine leads about our framework. Then, of course, we have ubiquity, because in the post-pandemic world, everybody and their dog are actually online. And we experience that all across the EU, even in countries that previously had lower internet penetration rates than they currently feature. So there's strong public interest, and here's where EU policy and EU law start stepping in order to prevent having 24 variants of each type of legislation propagating across the member states. Let's recall that the EU is composed by 27 sovereign member states. Each one can decide democratically to pass any sort of legislation it seeks. And the EU comes as the harmonization layer above. Now, coming more closely to your question, Bill, I would hate missing the forest for the tree. Meaning that when we come across compliance requirements, I think it's important to look at the full stack. It's difficult just to skim through and just find which one is slightly more visible or important than others. We get the legislation that has its own stipulations, but let's not forget about secondary legislation as well as guidance. For instance, when it comes down to NIS or to DORA, maybe not DORA just yet, but we have guidance from EBA, another EU agency on banking, that outlines thresholds and specific metrics in order to ensure compliance. I find that quite important. It's a pattern that we have followed, and we see it through across EU legislation. In much more closer to home on EU cybersecurity certification, for instance, Although I cannot claim any schemes adopted just yet, we'll break the news soon about it, but guidance plays a very important role, both for the purpose of explaining to the users, the stakeholders, what they need to do, but also to give more flexibility to the member states, to the public authorities across the member states, to give their own interpretations, because these interpretations are dynamic. They need to be commensurate with the perception of threat.
So, Andreas, picking up on this theme of, there's so much more to European cybersecurity requirements than, GDPR. I think there is a theme for many who are listening in, either because they're in Europe or they're in the United States or elsewhere. They know that there's a big data localization component to data protection law in Europe. And this is also a theme in some of the EU cybersecurity requirements. So I was wondering if you could pick up on this when it comes to, not just the proposals that are out there, but some of the things that are really big picture requirements on the horizon, whether it's the EU cloud certification, harmonization effort, the labeling requirements, how the Cyber Resilience Act might work. Could you talk a bit about how the concept of, data sovereignty and localization might figure in to this, and just how companies should be thinking about this, not just about personal information, but about just the way technology services and everything else will be coming together?
Sorry, that's a great question, David. Actually, the EU law can be extraterritorial, extrovert, and introvert at the same time. If it had to be a personality. So in the GDPR, I think you rightly suggest, and I'm pretty confident that my good friend Patrick van Eyck, who was in the panel just before, highlighted the extraterritoriality dimensions of the GDPR. We can also notice the requirements on data localization, as you highlighted, and allow me also to bring forward the positive response by service providers, particularly the large ones with the deep pockets and they could invest all across the EU in terms of data centers, particular services that are geared and tailored to the need, they cater to the needs of the end users that must meet the requirements of the GDPR. So although the response back in the day, as I remember it, when the GDPR was still in discussion, were, I would even say, slightly daunting, on how this regulation could resonate with within the industry. The response, in the end of the day, is not that bad, and probably the industry recognizes the merits of doing business in the United States, doing business in the EU, where you have regulation, but you also have a dynamic, advanced, open market once you are past the threshold, and doing business in Asia or elsewhere, maybe outer space. So what I'm trying to say is that you see increments to these approaches, and currently perhaps the hottest of the hot potatoes is related to the cloud scheme. Now, we have the task and the pleasure in ENISA to make recommendations about cybersecurity certification requirements concerning cloud services. Up until 2 years ago, on the calendar, 2 years ago, we thought that these criteria were purely technical and organizational. We even took the step of reaching out to the fellow European standardization organization, Senelec, with 2 discrete proposals to produce a European standard on on the requirements and on how you conformity assess against those requirements. And they've done it. We hope, we're looking forward to adoption of these 2 standards by Q2 next year. And then what do you know? The member states, or at least some of them, required that sovereignty-related requirements be inserted on the scheme. Of course, we responded in all sorts of ways, and there's been a lot of interest, including interest by the press. But there, of course, we've shifted in a whole new area. Perhaps the good news from the service provider standpoint, especially from across the Atlantic, is that the whole framework on certification is voluntary. The scheme itself is voluntary. So whatever requirements are put on top as an assurance level, or more specifically an evaluation level within an assurance level, because it's an evaluation level 4 within assurance level 3 for the good experts among you, it means that you do not necessarily have to qualify for the entire stack, depending on what's the business case. Now, here's another suggestion, because when we looked into equivalence vis-a-vis FedRAMP, we made the observation that FedRAMP is based on a taxonomy and on the qualification of service providers for across discrete services on that taxonomy, whereas in the EU, the approach is that you get the full stack. You do not identify specific services, simply the assurance levels, and once somebody is conformity assessed, then they can offer any type of services within that assurance level. Now, the assurance level, of course, is very much related to the type of customers that one expects to have. The service provider expects to, if they expect to serve high-end banking, yes, assurance level high might be due, but if it's consumer products like the photos of my kids, they're very important to me. I wouldn't like them to leak, but I would barely ever expect or even afford anything above assurance level basic. That would be fantastic already. Why would that be fantastic? Because currently, business and consumer-like users alike, they benefit from what? Contractual terms or certified services according to private schemes, like the Cloud Security Alliance. And sometimes they might just have also a qualification from a member state. In the EU, we have schemes in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, and so on. But now we will have something slightly more robust. With all respect for these schemes, their requirements have flown into the ENISA proposal. But of course, it's far better when several layers of reviews have taken place. So we expect in the end of the day that the user experience will be sufficiently good. Then again, even from a service provider standpoint, it's just a matter of rearranging the business. Let's not forget that the scheme is about certifying the service, not the service provider. The service provider only comes into the picture if particular use cases need to be served, perhaps in assurance, in evaluation level 4, in that very high level. And
Andreas,
of course,
no, sorry.
Among lawyers, I think we can sort it out. I would not be concerned about that. Sorry, Bill, I've run out of time.
I'm curious how you would react to you talked about rearranging the business and how these are voluntary, but I think there's a sense that whether this is actually voluntary will be, we shall see, because it may end up being required, or maybe as a practical matter, some of these dealing with the appropriate certification for the service providers will be necessary. How do you respond? And you probably have heard critique that these certifications can be viewed as like protectionist or measures that are aimed at kind of protecting the local economy at the cost of kind of other businesses from outside of the EU. I'm curious how you would react. I don't know whether you've heard that critique or whether that's something that you all think about when you think about these certifications.
Sure. Let me just start from the suggestion that the European Union is a union based on the rule of law, and any legislation it passes needs to meet the requirements of WTO. As a matter of fact, since the Legal Act, the Implementing Act, which is a Commission implementing regulation, based on a Commission decision, I think it's 182 of 2011, if anyone wants to Google it. It would be put through the scrutiny of WTO before it is proposed and for adoption. Now, with this in mind, any concerns about discrimination based on country of origin would not hold that much, because even if anything skipped to the attention of the legislator of the proposed act, it would be picked somewhere else down the road. Therefore, the concern could be made. I mean, actually, the argument could be made, and for the sake of it, it's fine to have the discussion. But in practice, I would barely see the point to it. Then we talk about the market, which in 2018 was approximately $250 billion big, and currently is about $500 billion. So it grew at a CAGR rate of 18%. Now the growth rate for the forthcoming period is subsiding slightly. It's closer to 15 or 14%. But still, it's quite impressive, and the size of it is massive. Now imagine that over 65% of that market is controlled by US service providers, and that includes the 3 hyperscalers we all love and use, plus another couple of companies, including Oracle, for instance, with the 2% as it appears. So the largest European supplier merely accounts for approximately 25 to 30% of one of the hyperscalers. So if anybody wanted to pump that up, I mean, just capturing that market, even just within the trade region like the EU, would take an enormous amount of investment, ingenuity, innovation in order to substitute services that are tried, tested, and well-funded, and with such good resonance in the market for so many years, for over a decade now.
So Andreas, it's a good point. I mean, given the market and how it's, access to the market is set up, some of these new requirements, I think, are going to be a real test for a lot of organizations. So, for example, and I know that this is not settled yet, but we'd love your if you could share your reflections on the vulnerability reporting requirements that will be coming out, for example, under the Cyber Resilience Act, or just generally. That I know that in Brussels there might be, a proposal or regulation or act directive that would call on ENISA to receive vulnerability reports. So we're wondering if you could comment, briefly on, some of these practical requirements. How do you think they might get implemented? And just, if you're a business listening to this, watching not just the press reporting about it, but what's actually coming out of Brussels, what should they begin to do? Because, a CISO at a global company, whether they're a service provider you're describing or a company that is highly regulated, might be dealing with these higher assurance levels, they might think that they need to basically plug their SIM, whatever collects all their logs, basically give ENISA direct access to that. Which I know is not really what is intended, but there's such extensive reporting obligations. Be interested in your comments on this in terms of, as a practical matter, how you think it will work, and whether it's something that small and medium-sized or even larger businesses could do. And frankly, is it something ENISA wants to have happen?
David, I think it makes sense just to highlight that the digital sector, according to at least one accounting, comprises of 117 instruments currently. So it's a massive rule book that has developed essentially in the last give or take 12, 15 years. I mean, before that, we had very few instruments. We can reflect that until the Digital Services Act came about, we just had the Electronic Commerce Directive since 2001. And then on Trust Service Electronic Signatures, we had an instrument in 99, another one in 2014 and 13, and then we're looking into an amendment currently. But the size of it, over 100 instruments, is massive. So undoubtedly, there are aspects that perhaps need to be systematically or slightly more systematically viewed. If we don't look on cybersecurity, we take the Data Act and the Data Governance Act, for instance.
Right.
We see provisions like altruistic data sharing, which needs to be somehow explained and better understood. The data spaces perhaps need to be elaborated, because what happens if you have innovative business models that look into e-health and perhaps sports or space at the same time, just because you have a GPS-enabled little thingy on your pocket or in your wrist that also measures blood pressure or whatever, so sugar levels. So indeed, I mean, inevitably we will get at the systemic level, we will get slight inconsistencies. The CRA, which you mentioned before, is it's an incredibly far-reaching instrument. I mean, it is effectively an internal market instrument in cybersecurity clothing. And I'm not making any further suggestions about the animal kingdom here. But indeed, I mean, vendors would have to bring together all their experience from conformity assessing, self-assessing their products, particularly the ones with digital elements, as you rightly highlighted, in order to pass this new set of hoops ahead and get the CE mark. The requirements underneath do not quite change, because the CRA sets this new framework, but then it makes reference to Regulation 765 of 2008 and Decision 768 of 2008. So whoever had experience into placing products in the EU market, they can build on that and just pass a new set of requirements. Now, if we wanted to make the life slightly easier for everyone who has already an obligation to certify products under a different set of rules, we should be responsive, and that's what we're doing in ENISA. We're looking into mapping the requirements of the common criteria scheme with the requirements, excuse me, of the CRA. And the common criteria scheme is very much alive and kicking, because from the SOGIS website, we gather that from the 750 certifications we had 2 or 3 years ago, that has cranked up by 40–50%, and we have over 1,300 currently. So it's still dynamic. So the CRA is of interest, because these common criteria certified products tend to be found all across in the industry.
So Andreas, mindful of time, I mean, you just mentioned what sounds like hundreds of different laws and regulations that have nothing to do with GDPR for the audience. What should have, which we all know because we practice in this space, but from your perspective, what should companies be doing right now? Should they be doing that crosswalk of those regulations, the common criteria with CRA? What are the 2 or 3 things you think they should be doing right now, looking ahead to make sure they can comply?
I suppose if I had to think as a corporate attorney, I should not think that I need to panic. Of course, you need to understand what's the landscape because it changes, but doesn't change in any sort of dramatic way. There's a wealth of information, open source information around for somebody just to get a bit of a sense of orientation, and then, of course, seeking specialized advice might be not such a bad idea. We noticed, as I mentioned, with the GDPR that the industry responded by setting up data centers, for instance, in order to help their customers. This also suggests that there will be multipliers that will provide such solutions readily made. You do not need to be the controlled entity. You do not need to be the control vendor under the CRA. If, for instance, you produce semiconductors, then you just pass that product down to someone else in the value chain, and perhaps that someone else, or even someone after, is the one that should be controlled under the CRA. We have very large companies, global companies based in the United States, that produce semiconductors, and their customers list probably is about 150, not even 200 long. I mean, because they know who they deal with. There are concerns about the supply chain. I think I will close with what I mentioned at the start. So perhaps the SBOM, the bill of material, the software bill of material is very important, and knowing who contributes to the supply chain is becoming ever more important for both business as well as geopolitical reasons.
I mean, for an audience out in the world who are listening to this, I think it's pretty obvious that there's a much deeper supply chain look that you need to look at, particularly when you're dealing with your European cybersecurity requirements and cloud. I'll turn it over to Bill to ask our last question. I know we're running short on time.
Yes, and maybe just to round it out. I think at this point we maybe just want to focus on any one takeaway, Andreas, you want to give for the audience as we're rounding things out, if briefly for time.
Sure. Perhaps something I skipped is something more concrete on vulnerabilities handling. It seems to me, although it's still quite unclear with the CRA what will eventually be, that ENISA will not play such a dramatic role. Probably the first point to report will remain the national CSIRT, so existing practices probably will carry on being the preference of choice. And ENISA, if it collects the information at some stage, it might just provide guidance or recommendations, but I would not believe that people would verge that far away from what has been tested in practice.
So ENISA will not be receiving, thousands of vulnerability reports from every company.
Yes, indeed. I cannot say yes or no, but it's because this whole matter is unclear to me. But I mean, it's if I had to take a guess, I mean, in the springtime we noticed that during the Swedish presidency there was a legislative proposal pointing the arrows from ENISA to the member states. Then the arrows were reversed. So currently, let's see what comes out. But this reversal suggests doubt. So there you go.
Well, Andreas, we are grateful for your expert commentary and reflections. We know that these are closely held determinations, but many in the world are watching closely at what's happening not only in Brussels but in Athens. So just really grateful for your comments today.
Many thanks for the opportunity, David. Many thanks to all.
I second that, Andreas. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights with us. And David and Bill, great job moderating. Thank you so much. And our next panel is in about 3 minutes on managing incidents impacting global enterprises. We'll be right back.